Welcome to our pandemic and privacy webinar. Apologies if there was a minor technical glitch there. I think my internet connection is a bit unstable at the moment, so please bear with me or let me know if you can't hear anything. I'd first like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting. I pay my respects to their elders past and present and the Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be here today. My name is James Conadaris. I'm a Senior Associate at the Communications Group at Squire, Patton, Boggs, and part of the Australian Chapter Committee of the International Institute of Communications. We're delighted to have you all with us this morning as our panellists take a deep dive into the privacy implications of contact tracing apps. For over 50 years, the IIC has been connecting regulators, industry experts, and innovators as the global communications industry has seen tremendous change, yet the impact of COVID-19 is unprecedented. We have a fantastic panel of speakers today who I will briefly introduce you to before I hand you over to our moderator. Malcolm Crompton is founder and lead privacy advisor at Information Integrity Solutions, a consultancy specialising in data protection and privacy strategies. He was Australia's Privacy Commissioner from 1999 to 2004, the founding president of the International Association of Privacy Professionals Australia New Zealand, and has been a member of numerous advisory bodies around the world, including the EU, OECD, APEC, and the New South Wales Data Analytics Centre. Malcolm was made a member of the Order of Australia in 2016 for significant service to the community and public administration, particularly to data protection, privacy, and identity management. Samantha Yorke works in government affairs and public policy at Google Australia, with a focus on privacy, safety, and security. She's an accredited mediator, technology lawyer, and policy advisor with over 20 years' experience working within the digital.
How are you going, James? We've had a little bit of a break in transmission there, James. I might assist in this regard and just step in. Good morning, everybody. My name is Margie.
And technology Google.
Sorry, James, we've just got some problems with transmission from your front, but look, if I can just step in here. My name's Margie Tannock. I'm a partner with Squire, Patton, Boggs, and I head up the regulatory team, which includes advising clients in relation to data privacy and cybersecurity. The final of our panelists is actually, and I'll just introduce, that is Nadia. And Nadia Levin is going to be providing us with an analysis of research implications. Now, we'll give you a little bit more of some specifics around her bio as well when we head into that. I'm delighted to be involved in this. Thank you so much to James, Joanne, Ryan for giving us this opportunity to put this together for the IIC. The structure of today's discussion will be, first of all, we will have commentary from each of our panelists.
Sorry, Margie, if you can hear me speaking, if you could kick things off, I'll try and reconnect again.
Thank you very much, James. So if I can just give you an idea of the indications that we have today, what we're going to be doing is each of our speakers will be given the opportunity to present to the audience in terms of their particular specialty. And as James has indicated, we have a fantastic diversity of speakers. We have the expert consultant who advises into major government institutions and private organisations being Malcolm. We have the key industry contact, which is Samantha, and her perspective is going to be incredibly interesting and prescient in terms of where they sit at the moment. And then, of course, front and centre, the researcher, who not only is giving us the historical perspective, but we hope also a reach into the future in terms of what these types of implications are going to offer. Each of our speakers are going to be speaking to their particular area. We will then have some questions between the panelists and myself to give you a flavour for the sorts of things that we think might be of interest to the audience. And then we hand over to you, the audience, for opportunities to provide questions to our panelists. And we will do our absolute utmost to answer as many of them as we can. But you might find, given the breadth of the topic and the volume that we might be able to speak to, We may well run out of time on this, but we do hope to be in a position to address as much as we can. We do have quite a tight time frame today, and we will be closing out at 10 o'clock. But firstly, as I said, if I can initially hand over to Malcolm Crompton. He is going to be speaking to the COVID Safe app and the protective legislation introduced by the Australian government, and it really does set up the platform for this discussion on pandemic and privacy. So thank you again, Malcolm, for joining us, and can I hand over to you?
Thank you very much indeed, Margie. Australia has taken a interestingly unique approach to introducing tracing apps around the world. There's any number of tracing apps now emerging, sometimes government sponsored, sometimes private sector sponsored, sometimes all tumbling all over each other. Arguments about centralised databases versus decentralised databases, arguments about how much data should be collected, how long it should be stored. It's all over the place if you look at it globally. So Australia has taken a particular approach, which I think is interestingly highly defensible. And what we need to recognise, which I actually think is quite surprising, is that we have a federal government that, if you want me to be blunt, has been incompetent in handling of data and untrustworthy in handling of data, and now it wants extreme trust. And the only thing you can do in a circumstance like that is demonstrate trustworthiness, because trust is the gift that is given to you by other parties. So while they've done a combination of developing an app that has a whole series of consciously planned limitations in it, for example, it doesn't exchange location directly, but there may be exchanges of location indirectly, we can come to that. And it really tries to monitor only if two devices have been in close proximity with each other for a minimum length of time. So the app itself has been designed with a whole lot of data minimization principles built in there. But most importantly, the surrounding legislation is frankly stunning. I've never seen anything like it anywhere in the world on anything, and it's about building trust. It literally says any use of the data created by this app, its exchange, its use, its anything is illegal. Full stop. It's illegal for national security to access it. It's illegal for police to access it. It's illegal for anybody to access it. Full stop. With two small exceptions, which then builds those exceptions back in. One, for the specific purpose of contact tracing. Nothing wider than that, just contact tracing. And secondly, the release of de-identified data for some further research purposes. That's it. Then it goes on to have a set of other provisions in there that we don't need to talk about, but it sets out to use as many constitutional heads of power as can possibly be thought of to give the law overseas reach. It sets out to say that any coercion by anybody to actually load the app or use it is illegal. It then does the most extraordinary thing with a federal regulator, which says the federal regulator regulates state agencies. And that has been a reach that has been constantly denied for decades in the privacy sphere, even though it's been a clear product of recommendations of reviews over time. So this legislation is intended to be, as law, extremely strong and quite unique and very impressive. Its actual implementation, however, falls into the could do better basket. Unfortunately, as a former privacy commissioner, I watched the privacy commissioner and the office that the commissioner runs, the IIC, underfunded to an embarrassing degree. And how much extra funding was given to the IIC to run this whole system, which includes eliminating coercion, Australia-wide, economy-wide, education sector, policing, national security. How much money was given to the privacy commissioner to do that job? Nothing. So will this actually be enforced as opposed to a promise of enforcement? I think we're still watching, and so there are some weaknesses in the implementation of the law as opposed to the law itself. I really find it very hard to find big problems with the law itself. The demonstrable compliance is going to be an issue. But then we have some other aspects of implementation. Complete code release hasn't happened, notwithstanding promises. Some code releases happened, good. But even today, you can read additional vulnerabilities or inadequacies in the app being discovered and released, even though we're now 5 releases, I think it is, into updates to the app. The government has overpromised on the app's utility in all sorts of ways. The government could have probably done a lot better by being more modest. They have done a remarkable job of developing an app unbelievably quickly, getting it out into the public domain, and unbelievably quickly getting an extraordinary rate of take-up, even in a compliant society like Singapore. We've beaten Singapore hands down on the proportion of the population that's taken it up. There's been some significant achievements, but there's been overpromise on what the app can actually do, and the government should have probably said it, put a bit more sort of beta language into it to say, we've got this going fast, better to do that than to wait for perfection. Things will get better as we go. I think there's even some security vulnerabilities that haven't been dealt with. As I said before, particularly if it's iOS device to iOS device, the probabilities of it actually working properly could actually be quite low. By the time you multiply the probability of download by 2 parties, multiplied by is it working properly in both devices for 2 parties, multiplied by is one of those parties infected, we're getting to a very small number. Part of that, of course, is that Australia has in fact controlled the infection rate in regard to that last probability. But my point is, at the moment, it's not delivering. To a degree, it's not delivering because of these issues, but the best reason for not delivering at the moment is there's not much stuff to catch. So we could argue that the app is there in reserve, should be the second wave breakout, and then we would find out if it's working or not. But what we do need, I think, and Nadia will have another perspective on this, is it took some tension through the drafting of the legislation to get the government to agree that there should be regular reporting on the utility of this app. And that's a pity, because it should not have been a question at all. It should have been a straight up assumption that there would be regular reporting and assessment of the utility of this app. The law actually now does require some of that, probably not enough, but we now will then at least get some evidence of utility. In short, I think remarkable things have been achieved in the law. There are some wobblies in the implementation of the law, and there's some wobblies in the app, but Australia has done a better job than most of the rest of the world at this point, not just in controlling the spread of the pandemic, but how it's brought an app to the public.
Malcolm, thank you so much for really setting the scene for us. And Malcolm's point is a very good one. Just keep in mind that, you know, we are in Australia not the only one who is looking to implement this type of technology, but we are being watched with some considerable level of scrutiny as to how that is being undertaken and the different measures that are adopted, and particularly the legislative background. So thank you very much, Malcolm. And we will come back to Malcolm with questions from both panellists and me, and also the audience at a later stage. Can I now turn to Samantha Yorke as our second speaker for today? And just as a reminder, Samantha's presently Public Policy and Government Affairs Head at Google Australia. She's going to be speaking today about the critical interface of industry here, and particularly the background to Google and Apple's partnership to develop an exposure notification interface that works across both Apple iOS and Google Android mobile platforms. So she's going to talk about the privacy protections that are built in, and I'd very much like to welcome her and hand over to Samantha. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Margie, and good morning, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here with you this morning, virtually, of course. The COVID-19 pandemic is clearly impacting communities all over the world, and Google has been thinking long and hard about how we can best contribute towards the economy-wide recovery efforts that are underway. And where we've landed, essentially, after all that thinking, was that the best way that a company like Google could help is by lending support to the important work that public health authorities are doing to keep people safe and healthy and to gradually reopen communities. So contact tracing and exposure notification are core disease control methods that have been used by public health authorities for many decades now to help slow the spread of communicable diseases. An effective contact tracing regime is really quite critical to an economic recovery strategy because it helps contain the spread of the virus, and it plays a critical role in preventing any second waves that would necessitate a return to restrictive stay-at-home guidelines. So as Margie has mentioned, Google and Apple collaborated on an exposure notification API, or application program interface, to ensure that contact tracing apps that can work across both iOS and Android devices and talk to each other seamlessly. And of course, technology that can supplement traditional contact tracing in a number of very critical ways. For example, exposure notification helps address some of the limitations of traditional contact tracing. Technology that we've been working on with Apple, for instance, does not require people to remember or even know everybody that they've come into contact with. It can be deployed at scale with lower costs. So the API that we have developed and the apps that are being made available by public health authorities, including the Australian government, are all free to use. And they can help people self-quarantine a lot more quickly when they're exposed, which experts agree is key to preventing the spread of the virus. But in order to design an exposure notification technology that's genuinely helpful, we engaged extensively with public health authorities around the world, and they gave us really extensive and great feedback along the way, particularly during the testing period that took place in the latter weeks of May. So as a result, the technology that Google and Apple have built together is designed to protect people's privacy first and foremost. It does not reveal your identity. It does not reveal the identity of people that you've come into contact with, and it does not reveal the locations that you have been visiting or where you might have come into contact with somebody who had tested positive for the COVID-19 virus. Developers will not be allowed to access the Google and Apple API unless they are a government public health authority or they are building an app on behalf of a government public health authority. Developers must also agree to our terms of service in order to integrate the API into their app. So for example, they must meet standards that ensure strict privacy protections, including data minimization, to only request information that is required for COVID response efforts, to not use data collected through any app for law enforcement or punitive purposes, and to not use an app or data collected from the app for advertising purposes. Another protection that we've built into the terms of service is that apps that are using our API will be prohibited from requesting permission to access other types of information that might be available on that device, including location information, contact information. But do note that developers can ask for individuals to voluntarily share additional information, such as their phone number, their age range, or indeed a postcode. Use of the API is also very strictly limited to COVID-19 response efforts. There are no other use cases permitted under the terms of service that we ask developers to sign up to. We've also taken the decision to limit access to our API to one per country. And the reason that we've done this is because we're very mindful of the potential for fragmentation and therefore erosion of effectiveness of any app if there are a number of apps being used across a given country. And fortunately, thus far, at least in Australia, we've just seen the one federal government app. We've also made a very clear condition of using our technology that public health authority apps cannot require that people share any sensitive data categories. So this includes racial information, ethnic origin, religious disability data, gender, sexual orientation, and that no data collected through the use of these apps that integrate the Google and Apple technology can be used to discriminate against or marginalize any individual or group based on any of those sensitive data types. So our technology does reflect contributions from a wide range of experts, and it meets our 3 goals of giving users control. So users decide whether or not they choose to opt in to use any app that incorporates our technology. It gives users privacy and peace of mind. User locations are never collected or used. Users decide whether to report a diagnosis through the app, and their identity is never known to Apple, Google, or any other users. And our last commitment is really just around being transparent for the purposes of this app and any underlying technology that forms a part of these apps. The technology will only be used for fighting COVID-19 and will be disabled on a regional basis as the disease is contained. So we strongly believe that privacy protections will encourage more people to use these contact tracing apps and ultimately save lives, hopefully by providing an early warning to people who might have been exposed. So that is why we developed our API to not require the app to collect or use any personal information to deliver notices, and does not require the processing of information in a centralized way. Malcolm's already alluded to the debate around decentralized versus decentralized models. The model that Google and Apple have adopted is a decentralized one. So the exposure notification technology that we've built has been largely well received by privacy and human rights groups around the world, as well as by policymakers who understand the critical role that privacy plays in building public trust in these apps. And so speaking of public trust, it might now be a good time to hand back to Margie to introduce Nadia.
Thank you so much, Samantha. As we have spoken about, very much the focus of today's discussion is all about unpacking these tensions between protecting privacy rights while achieving public health outcomes. And as you will have heard from our first speakers, there is very much a common goal here. It is a matter of application and developing a level of digital and public trust that will enable the best health outcomes possible. And I also now turn to Nadia Levin, and she will be speaking from the research perspective, and that is very much all about, quite frankly, the glue that holds these discussions together. How is it that we are able, that the public was able to be delivered in such a comprehensive fashion, the type of legislation that Malcolm has described, and how is it that an industry that, broadly speaking, may well have some public perception issues in terms of control and usage of data. How was it that these two things were able to be implemented? Well, obviously the foundation primarily is research. If I can just also just give you a little brief background to Nadia, because we didn't quite get to that at the front end of this discussion. Nadia is the CEO and Managing Director of Research Australia, and she's been in that role for 4 years. She's engaged with our top leaders in research, universities, research institutes, pharmaceutical companies, biotech innovators, and all levels of government. She came to this role, in fact, with a very strong record in any event from executive leadership at the Australian Nuclear Science and Technology Organisation. And she was also a director of the Australian Synchrotron board. Nadia, can I hand over to you?
Thanks, Margie. Thank you very much for that. I think the answer to the question in brief is, to the question you posed, is serendipity in the first instance, with a little bit of legislation around it and a healthy dose of cynicism. Data is indifferent. It just is. But my goodness me, how much emotion does it generate? Do the discussions around it generate, from the issues of consent, regulations, usage, linkage, storage, access? The list is never ending, and these are non-trivial issues. I suppose what I'm going to do is do a bit of a meander through from the app itself through to broad societal perception of data, and from a research perspective, what that means. I just want to clarify as well, I'm not a researcher, which makes me even more suspicious of most things as a result, but I'm absolutely passionate about the role that health and medical research and research more broadly plays in our society. And I think that's the nub. It is about literacy, whether it be health literacy, whether it be technology literacy, digital literacy. Technology has evolved at a pace that our knowledge as civil society hasn't kept up with. And as a result of that, we have a healthy dose of cynicism and skepticism. I do think some of that is just a naturally Australian thing. We are mistrustful of authority. And we do exactly what we should be doing as indicative of a democracy, is feel free to question and indeed to criticise. Malcolm spoke about the legislation, talking about it not being perfect, but pretty damn good, if I paraphrase. I think the fact of the matter is that we, but we have a community and a civil society that is happy to participate. We had the privacy groups and the civil libertarians who were able to engage with the federal government on the draft legislation while supporting the use of the potential of the COVID Safe app, but raised some very valid points and tested theories both in the legislation or potentially unintended consequences. And these were taken up with alacrity, with open mind, as government recognised that in order for success, they needed to take these concerns on board. You could question, would they have, should they have been aware of these issues beforehand? Yes, perhaps, but nothing's perfect. No one's perfect. The question I was sort of ruminating on as Malcolm was speaking was, could the private sector have done it better? And no doubt Samantha will have a view on that. Should government have stepped out completely? Would our trust levels have changed? Would we be more comfortable if Google was running the app and supplying the information to government when it was needed, and had nothing to do with it or very little to do with it? Where would our trust levels change when it comes to government involvement? I put to the group that technology lets government down every time. I defy you to point to a project that has required technology in government, whether it be at a federal or a state level, and tell me one of those projects that has come in on time and on budget. I don't think it exists. And part of that is simply the nature of technology. It moves quickly. What's in vogue today and how things evolve, it goes quickly. Government decision-making processes don't move that fast. Policy and legislation just doesn't move that fast. Now, should it move faster? Yes. What has this pandemic demonstrated? It's demonstrated certainly from a legislative point of view on the COVID Safe Act, but also in health and medical research, that we can be more flexible and more agile. And so that's the silver lining from this hideousness that we are living through at the moment. And I guess that's the opportunities that it allows for us to think about and utilise. I mean, health and medical research generally takes 17 years from bench to bedside, clinical trials, running massive amounts of data to wade through and understand how we don't kill people, but rather heal them and make them better. We need data to enable us to do that. And it is painstaking, the collection of it, the analysing of it, the use of it. This takes time. But can we use technology itself to make those decisions and those things move a lot faster? And I won't obviously touch on things like, what's beyond big data and machine learning, deep learning, actionable data, what's the business value? I mean, these are all things that are coming into our lives. Data is ubiquitous. We also have an interesting take on our own risk-benefit analysis. I mean, I think about my own approach to data, and I live pretty much on my mobile phone. I do my banking on my mobile phone. I do my communicating on my mobile phone. I could be attending this today on my mobile phone. And when I can't use my mobile phone for my convenience, I get quite frustrated. So just engaging with government services, having to, punch in the same information over and over again, I'm going, for goodness sake, just make it really easy. So I have an expectation of how data should be utilised for me as a citizen, and I want to see that happen. Now, what am I prepared to trade in order for that convenience? And that's the big question that I think we need to be, that conversation that we need to be having as a society as we mature into what technology is, means, and does for us, and what that's going to look like despite us in the future, because it is moving at an alarming pace and is going to do so regardless. You know, the notion of off-grid, I mean, you know, what does that even look like? How does somebody go off-grid and not engage with society at all? I mean, is it possible? I guess it may be. How soon do you have to start that? I mean, how do you not engage? And engaging means that you're going to have to share data in order to get something. And that comes to the notion of reciprocity. You walk into a hospital, you go and see a GP, you're not feeling well, or a family member's not feeling well, you want to be treated. Well, that expectation is fair, but the only reason that doctor or that hospital is able to treat you is because of other people's data that has been made available in order for them to use that and get to a point that they can help you today. So that comes to, what is your participation in society? What are you prepared to put in order that you may draw out, particularly if you expect somebody else to pay for it? And obviously it's, you know, from a health perspective, we are very fortunate as a country that we have a system that in part supports us in that way, that you can turn up to a hospital and have treatment as a result. So from a researcher's perspective, data is lifeblood. Without data, there is no research. The key is, how do we as a nation approach and access and use data, understand the transformative power that data harness, that transformative power that data has in all of our lives, with maintaining the levels of privacy, and again, people's thresholds are different, the levels of privacy and ownership that we feel we need to have over the data. I was talking to friends when it came to, you know, downloading the COVID Safe app, and my opinion was, I want to return to a life more normal. And if this app is going to help us do that, then let's do it. Let's just get on with it. And, you know, it's a case of, I've got nothing to hide, therefore the government's not really going to be that interested in me. You know, maybe I haven't returned a library book, you know, and I'll get into trouble for that. But I really, you know, it's pretty simple. I had a friend who said, well, I'm the same. I don't have anything to hide, but by the same token, I don't have anything to hide. So why should the government be interested in me? Why should I give them access to my data and my details? How can I be sure they're not going to use it for other purposes? And this is not a new debate. This is not a new concern. I mean, the digital My Health records just of a you know, a year or two back, we went through the same thing. Back when we were trying to get the smart card up and running in 2007, it was the same thing. And pre that was the Australia card. Government doesn't have a great track record. You know, you think about hacks and leaks, and I'll, you know, I remember saying, you know, somebody's going to put the question to the health minister, Minister, can you absolutely guarantee that no one is ever going to hack the My Health record data, and no one's ever going to be able to access the information? The answer to that is no. Google, Apple, the Australian government, any other government, no one can give you those guarantees. It's just, that's life. The question is, what is reasonable, and what are we prepared to accept as reasonable when we do our own risk-benefit analysis as to what we're prepared to hand over and what access we're prepared to have people and things that people want to know about us. I'm a little bit of a fatalist in that I think that any government who wants to know anything about any of us can anyway, and I know that that can be a really disturbing thought. If anybody's been watching the ABC just this week and the secret trial of Bernard Colleroy, I mean, that's cause for concern. We don't have the full picture, we don't have the full story, but we trust that government will do the right thing. I think that most of the time, most governments do the right thing. There are times, however, that they don't or they won't. Most of the times it's incompetence rather than deliberate. Because there are people just like us who are holding those government jobs. But for me, the safeguard is critical thinking. And I think it's key to any democracy. It's fundamental to a democracy, that critical thinking, the ability, the right to question, the space to question, to be able to ensure that we can reach a threshold of reasonable that we all feel comfortable with, means that we can engage in that meaningful debate. So again, I don't trivialize any of the concerns or any of the issues that any of us have at any particular point in time. I think the concerns are real. I think the price of freedom is eternal vigilance, whether that be from a country point of view or whether it be from examining a piece of data legislation that purports to keep us safe in the middle of a pandemic. Always question, always be suspicious, if you like, but I think it's a question of an open mind as to what we want to achieve at the end of the day. As you can hear, it's a subject that I'm passionate about, but I'll stop there to allow for questioning in the interests of time.
Thank you very much, Nadia. Fantastic discourse into lots of areas, some of them in fact more philosophical than anything else, but it is absolutely occupying the minds of the public, and certainly it's a subject of public conversation, which is quite frankly a terrific thing. What I'm going to do now is I am going to turn to the panellists and have a discussion amongst the panellists in terms of some key themes that were brought through as those initial presentations from each of the panellists. And then after that, as I said, we will then turn over to the audience themselves. There are some questions coming through, and I do encourage the audience, if you'd like to participate by way of written questions, there is a Q&A function at the bottom of the screen if you're watching on screen, and you are able to type in a question and I can put those to the panellists. If you have a particular panellist in mind, please note that, and I'm very happy to address it on that basis, but otherwise I can open it up broadly for comment with everybody. But it is very much about the audience questions and issues that have been raised as a consequence of some of the discussions that have been had today. But if you do have discussions which necessarily sit outside the bandwidths this morning, please don't hesitate to put those forward as well, and we're very happy to address those. Can I just touch on first a particular aspect which has been spoken to by both Nadia and Samantha, but I'm sure Malcolm will have a view as well. And it really is about, the question is about what's next. And I'll put it to Samantha at first instance. It's really about the commoditisation of data and the opportunities that are available, either for industry, government agencies, or in fact, private entities per se, to take advantage of the collation of this type of data and what it then can be used for, and if there is any prospect of being able to monetize the sort of data that is being considered and reviewed at the moment. Samantha, does Google have any views in relation to this at the moment in terms of the collation and utilisation of the types of information that we're talking about?
Yeah, so categorically, Margie, the answer to the question of whether Google would use this type of information and data collected through this technology for the purposes of monetizing the data, whether it's for advertising or other purposes, categorically the answer is no. And this is a condition that we've included in the terms of service of our technology. So by extension, any public health authority that is utilising our exposure notification technology also is prohibited from using any data collected through their app for the purposes of advertising. So it's a pretty categorical no from my perspective.
That's absolutely understood. But what happened if there was the opportunity, and this is really about planning for the future in terms of what happens after, if Australia comes through, and is able to consistently manage these health risks, there remains these opportunities in terms of data. What happens if there was an opportunity for individuals or groups of individuals to provide consent for the monetisation of that types of data? Malcolm, would you like to speak to that?
Yes. I was fortunate enough to be working in Department of Finance in Canberra during the Australia Card debate. The promise of government at the time was this card will be used for a very finite number of purposes. The government put out a call to all ministries late in the piece to say, This card will be used for very limited purposes. Has anybody got a proposition that would fit within that barrier? I looked at the pile of cabinet submissions that described everybody's last bid. That pile was a metre high of cabinet submissions of future uses of the Australia card. There was the future written down. If I look at the metadata retention bill, Senator Brandis, as the Attorney General, promised that the privacy advantage of the metadata retention bill was that it would reduce the number of organisations that can access metadata and improve the process, legal process for so accessing. The limit was about 20 organisations at the time. It has already spread to well over 100 organisations are accessing that data. So the first issue is don't make a promise that you can't keep. And all promises that have the word never written into them are promises that aren't kept. You can say, this is our current intent. Should we change our mind, this is the process that we'll go through. You can't say never. Governments are saying never all the time. So we are, if we're basing it on promises, we have to be very careful about the promise. I do have a couple of other remarks to make that just haven't been surfaced. One of them is the thinking of Kahneman and others, where the human being is genetically, I repeat, genetically incapable of properly assessing the risk between short-term gain and loss over the long term. Second of all, that inability of a human being to do that is consciously, and I use the word consciously, exploited by companies in how they make promises to individuals, especially because the promise as made is usually literally unreadable, but you can summarize those 30-page promises into one sentence. We will collect everything about you that we can, in any way that we can, from any source that we can. We will keep it forever, use it for anything, and sell it to anybody. Well, why don't you say that? And the point of the government's legislation on the COVID app was to make absolutely finite promises with no ministerial discretion. One of the reasons this stuff goes wrong is that too many laws are passed these days where the change out, breaking the promise, is through ministerial discretion subordinate to the law. Now, the last part is to say this is a broken glass, but it's repairable. In every other part of our complex lives, the world has been made safe by the same model. The model is a framework is written by somebody or an organisation that is trustworthy. The model is that the entity that wants to provide the service or make the something or be a professional is tested against that framework. The model is that that is funded by the entities that want to make use of that model. It's often enforceable in law. To the extent that it's enforceable in law, Parliament has never designed a motor car, Parliament has never designed an aeroplane, Parliament has never written the accounting standards, Parliament has never written any of those frameworks. Sometimes what Parliament does is to say things like, a motor car cannot be sold in Australia unless it meets a standard. There shall be a standards setting body, there shall be a standards testing body, and then it's put away to professionals who can move more quickly than parliaments can. Everybody rails against the law because it's slow. The value of law is that it's slow, because it has to be stable to have any impact, for goodness sake. So you break these things up the right way. This is a tried and tested model from the clothes that we wear, the building that we live in, the airplane that we get in, the car that we drive, the doctor that we visit, everything. We don't apply it to data. So at the moment, we're being fooled into taking up a less than trustworthy system. But data in the last 20 years has moved from being nice to have to unlivable without. But we haven't built the corresponding strength of framework around it, including all of the auditing processes that are necessary. And if anybody argues that the auditing process can't be afforded, they're basically saying that the marginal benefit of the proposition is so marginal that the cost of auditing changes the benefit cost ratio to no need to proceed. So I will never believe the argument that you can't run assurance processes over these allegedly extraordinarily valuable things. My last remark, I'm on the board of Bellberry Limited. Bellberry Limited is a not-for-profit company that provides the Health Research Ethics Committee services to around about 1/3 of Australia's phase 1 trials and a lot of other stuff as well. Bilberry is therefore deeply involved in a process that is like this. There's the National Health and Medical Research Council that writes the rules, and the research ethics committees are set up to apply those rules and keep an eye out. So for certain aspects of research data, we already have some of these assurance mechanisms in place. We do not have them in place for all of the rest of the other data users, which is what makes their data users so untrustworthy in so many circumstances. We can use the argument that government is different from the private sector and that we can take it or leave it in the private sector, but those who received the robo-debt letter had no choice. I could continue, but I think there's a lot more of the unpacking needed.
Thank you very much, Malcolm. Nadia, can I just pose a question to you from our audience, very much from a research perspective? Will the COVID experience, do you think, change Australian citizens' willingness to give data to get the benefit of data-based research? And how will we know if that view has in fact changed?
Yeah, that's a great question. Look, I think from a research perspective, we know that 91% of Australians feel comfortable sharing their de-identified data. This is a Research Australia longitudinal poll that we've been doing now for 17 years that tells us that they are prepared to share their de-identified data for research purposes. There is a high level of trust in the research community for the tracking of disease and the treatments of disease. What would be, and to Malcolm's point, a wonderful opportunity is to take the lessons from the research community in terms of how data is dealt with, the ethics hoops that it needs to jump through, and those themselves aren't perfect, but it does provide a level of assurance, and see how we can apply those across the usage of data, because these are not issues that are new to the research community. I mean, researchers, you know, you don't just get to a data set or access to a cohort and off you go. It is incredibly rigorous. And for the most part, researchers have very little interest in who you are and where you live. That's just not, unless they were doing epidemiological studies, and in which case consent would be sought for them to have those, for them to have access to that information. You know, when they're tracking disease, whether it be you know, a study that's already been completed, or a new angle of a question on a piece of research that's been done, or indeed a new question, that it's the data, the de-identified data that they need. You know, anything more about you is not relevant to what they're looking to do. So, you know, this was a balancing act when the My Health record came out, because there was an expectation that the research community would stand up and encourage everyone to you know, adopt the My Health record. And in principle, that's not a bad idea. But the point is that the rigor, whether or not it existed, and I would suggest that it didn't, certainly initially, but the implementation and the explanation of how it was going to work and what the safeguards were woeful. And generally it is in the implementation of these sorts of, whether it's apps or digital records or whatever that looks like, where we fail to make that divide across to the Australian public, to both build and test those levels of trust, and understand that, perceived or otherwise, if the trust isn't there and the concerns are there, that they're real and they need to be addressed.
Thank you very much. We are getting a few questions in, which is fantastic. And again, I continue to encourage the audience to do that. Samantha, can I put a question to you from our audience? What evidence exists for the effectiveness of exposure notifications as a public health intervention, if any? And do you think, or have you been able to identify if there is any evidence that people will self-isolate without the traditional contact tracing interaction with a public health professional to answer questions and explain things in a way that's sensitive to different contexts?
Yeah, look, it's a great question, and we certainly received a lot of feedback from public health authorities that contact tracing is indeed a very it's one very effective tool that can be used to move out of a pandemic such as the one that we've all been experiencing this year. And I think highlighting that it is one tool is important, because there unfortunately are no silver bullet solutions here. And as we've seen here locally in Australia, there's a number of tools that are being used, and contact tracing is one of those, to help move us out of the depths of the pandemic and into a recovery mode. I don't know if Nadia has anything specific that she can point to in the research community that supports the efficacy of contact tracing, but we've certainly heard from many authorities that it is a very effective tool. And I think for those that choose, for whatever reason, not to use contact tracing as a method to manage their own health, we should of course be providing alternative ways to get questions answered and to seek support outside of a contact tracing application framework for those who don't choose to participate in that.
Are there any additional comments on that?
Yeah, look, contact tracing, it might be a new public health tool in terms of the app of the technology itself, but in terms of the way it's done, previously it would be done by someone on the phone, and it's painstaking. It's time consuming and it's expensive. And in the time it's going to take a human being to have that conversation and trace, the longer an asymptomatic infected person remains in the community, spreading unknowingly the disease. So if technology means that we get to limit the spread of a disease through the use of technology, I just think it's a no-brainer. I think that I think there's a level of discomfort. As I was saying, that, I don't think we should be dismissing, and I think we should ensure that the safeguards are there, and they should continue to be evaluated. And evaluation and reporting, I think, is essential. If you've got nothing to hide, government, then show us, and show us regularly. But by the same token, our expectation is we want to participate in our lives as fully and as normally as possible, and there's a trade-off. Technology enables that contact tracing to happen a whole lot faster. Somebody writing down something on a piece of paper or typing it into a database, I struggle to see the difference between that and an app picking that up. I suppose the bigger question is what happens after that information is collected, whether it be manual or via technology. And those are the questions that we should be asking as to what happens with that information.
Right. So really at this stage, it's probably too early to say that there is a distinct effectiveness between exposure notifications as opposed to traditional contact tracing. You don't think that there is a broad distinction there at the moment in terms of evidential-based results?
I'm not sure I understand. Could you just run that by me again, please?
Yeah, sure. No, it was just a follow-up question. The question was specifically about effectiveness of exposure notifications as opposed to traditional contact tracing.
I think it's too early to call. I really do. And I think it's going to be difficult to generate that evidence in an Australian context because we've been so successful at flattening the curve. So I think this is one where the benchmark is going to be from other countries who have similar technologies, and we'll be able to extrapolate from that. I mean, that's the flip side of flattening the curve as successfully as we have.
Margie, in fact, the jury is out on that question worldwide. In last week or so, there was a glimpse that maybe Iceland had been able to, I think it was Iceland, had managed to make some demonstrable, effective further use of contact tracing through apps compared with traditional processes. But it's actually proving to be a worldwide question, not just an Australian question. And so we may be last to find out because we've managed to flatten the curve so much, but it's clearly difficult worldwide.
Understood. Look, thank you very much. I have one more question for you, Malcolm, but we've got a very limited amount of time on it, so perhaps just a brief response to that. And it is really about government funding, and you mentioned that in your presentation. And the question is privacy in Australia being fractured by decisions such as the lack of funding for the OAIC, for the Tracing Act, and other initiatives such as the Consumer Data Right Creating Privacy Safeguards and the ACCC Digital Review? Just a very brief. Thank you.
Really good question. There's too many regulators involved. How the Consumer Data Right was set up is just weird. There's no other explanation for it. But we actually, again, have a solved problem in another domain. Financial information is governanced by a standard and is governanced by the entity that collects financial information, paying for the governance through audit. For personal data, the same model can be applied. It isn't applied. That's where most of the funding will come from for proper governance of personal information in the future. And I can give you a numerical example if you want it, but we're probably out of time.
No, that's okay. Go ahead. We've got a couple more minutes.
Right. I asked this question in England. There's probably $10 billion spent on financial audit. Sorry, £10 billion, British pounds, double that for Australian dollars, spent on financial audit in Britain. When I asked the person who knew both sides of the coin on this one, what's the equivalent number for personal information in Britain, he basically nodded his head and said, I take your point. All of that £10 billion comes from the companies that have to be audited. That's the way you do it. You spread the funding cost. You don't ask the regulator to be the first line of enforcement, as is the case in Australia. You get the entities to pay for their own assurance, like you do for cars, for doctors, for planes, for financial information.
No, thank you. Thank you very much. Now, that's the end of our discussion today. Can I just add as a note, as the moderator, my thanks not only to the IIC for the opportunity to do this, but particularly to the panellists for their willingness to engage, the work that they've clearly put into the presentation this week. It's been a delight to meet you all, and really have enjoyed very much the opportunity to learn from each of you in relation to this. So thank you very much. James, can I hand over to you as to give a wrap up on this? You're transmitting? Fantastic, very exciting.
Thank you, and apologies for the technical issue earlier. I'll echo Margie's comments and say a big thank you to all of you, Malcolm, Nadia and Samantha. Thank you very much. And also to Margie for moderating today's event. Also to the IIC and the Squire, Patton, Boggs people who work behind the scenes to help bring today's webinar. Just in terms of some upcoming IIC events, our international colleagues will be hosting a webinar on Tuesday with a focus on cybersecurity and regulation in times of pandemic. And you can find details about that on the IIC website, iicom.org. And the Australian chapter is also in the process of pulling together an event on disinformation and misinformation to be held in August. So please keep an eye out for that. The Australian IIC website is iicom.org.au. Thank you all very much again for joining us today, and have a wonderful day.